to Relax with Rise. I'm Harmony Borden, and this is Chris Borden, my wonderful husband. And today we're going to go over how to compound and look at our compounded returns rather than just identifying what percentage return you're going to get, how it will look over time when you look at the compound ratio of it all. And I'm over here blabbing, and I can see the look on his face. So I'm going to quickly just turn it over to Chris so he can take over. Oh, hold on. I think I can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Now.
Uh-oh.
Oh, there you are.
Hopefully everyone out there can hear me. Can you hear me now?
Yep, that's better.
Okay, how about I just said, how about you introduce yourself real quick? You said your name, but who you are and what you do real quick, and I'll do the same.
Harmony Borden, and not only am I with Rise Capital, we raise capital and help others find opportunities along their journey and just try to find ways to give back. You know, everybody works so hard for the money and finding ways to make their money work for them. We are also a part of a nonprofit, which I love and can dedicate my everyday to. But basically, long story short, we have since left our W-2s, and this is what retirement looks like for us. And just do what we can to make the world a little bit better today than it was yesterday. That's our goal in life right now.
Yeah, sounds good. Is my boss. Whatever he says, I do. But we've had, as Harmony said, we left our W-2s or about 4 years ago. I was an executive, well, on a B suite and C suite for most of my career. It was in retail, more specifically grocery retail, and I did that for almost 20. Well, it was 20, a little over 27 years, where I ended up leaving the company as a CEO, a really large company across multiple states, primarily in Hawaii though. So now we're moving on, as Harmony said, we're in our retirement life, and now we are real estate investing full time. We started full time real estate investing roughly about almost 4 years ago for myself and my wife. It's been about 4 years for my wife. Slightly less for me. I stayed back, got ourselves. So we packed up. We're originally from Hawaii. We moved to the beautiful state of Utah. And everyone asked what it was to be closer to our children that moved away, and cost of living was high, so they did not want to come back, and they developed friends through schooling and different ventures of their life. So here we are today. I had a very, like I said, a very illustrious background in retail, but there's a lot of finances involved. When you become the CEO, you're sort of responsible for everything: marketing, operations, finances. So being able to learn and navigate that came relatively natural. Spelling was not my strong suit because returns is not spelled correctly, obviously. We're gonna talk about compounded. I don't even know
No,
how you
rent
say it.
runs, right? Rent
It
runs.
should be returns. So I kind of understanding. I think it's kind of important. I don't know, Harmony. You can maybe say what your thoughts is. I think too often times people jump into investing, and we're talking about alternative investments here, so things outside of the stock market. Obviously the stock market can get relatively complicated as well, because you're technically investing in different businesses, and being able to understand the fundamentals of the business can be somewhat overwhelming, especially if you haven't had experience to that. Again, luckily I have, but if you haven't had experience to that, it can get kind of daunting and overwhelming. But looking at it from the eyes of a return standpoint, and we're going to kind of dive in quickly. Again, this is a live, but we're going to dive in quickly kind of to the math. But let me kind of just segue. I mean, Harmony, what has been kind of your experience with looking at investments and trying to see if it's a good investment or not?
Well, definitely something I wish I learned sooner. Um, you know, there's so much opportunity within investing in general, but real estate investing has become a new passion. And things like this scare me. What you just pulled up, I would totally just be like, nope, not for me. But going outside of my comfort box and understanding that, finding a good deal, understanding how that looks, not just the formula side of it, but how it actually looks for the returns, and understanding that process is huge. So I think for me, it has definitely been an eye opener, and like I said, it's something I wish I would have learned sooner. And we've been teaching it to our kids. And if it's not my nonprofit we're talking about, I'm talking about how to diversify and get you better returns, because your money needs to work harder for you. And this has been perfect.
I think that's a good segue. 'Cause so even when I first started investing, well, we've been investing forever technically. We bought our first property. I think Harbordale was 18 or 19 at the time.
Yeah.
I was 4, so
Yeah.
um, yeah, a long time ago. But I think too oftentimes people get intimidated by just looking at the math behind it. And I put this up for a specific purpose of it is somewhat complicated, but we wanted to break it down and make it easier. When we first started, I would hear people talk about IRR and equity multiple, and more times than not, people navigated towards the equity multiple and didn't really look at the IRR. However, I think the IRR is extremely important, and I'll say why. You don't necessarily need to know how to calculate it. Honestly, I've never calculated it this way. I put it in Excel or ask. Nowadays, you can just ask ChatGPT to calculate it for you, as long as you have like the numbers, some of the input numbers that you have to put in. So not understanding net present value, time value of money. But the one thing that's important, so the equity multiple is one thing that people typically navigate towards because it's easy to understand, right? It's whatever my investment is times the multiple of whatever the return was. So if it's a 2x, I basically doubled my money. It's not hard to. It's really easy to mathematically understand how that calculation is done, and you're looking at it from doubling your money standpoint, and it makes sense, and it's easy to put that logic to work. Like, okay, if I invest this, I'm going to double it in X amount of time. However, you guys, the important thing to kind of know here is the IRR is basically the relatively return on your money, but taking into consideration the time that the money was put into an investment. So like, think about it. If I say I'm going to 2x your return, like again, a simple equity multiple, I'm going to double your return. I mean, that makes sense, but is that going to be in 2 years, in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years? It makes a big difference when I'm looking at that. So you can easily go off of your criteria. Okay, I want a 2x return in 5 years. That could be a relatively simple metric for you to use. However, over time, which is kind of more of what we're going to be talking about, compounding it is super important, and understanding just from a high level how that math works is really important. So I think everyone has heard this before. Like if I have $100 today, that $100 is worth less a year from now, right? There's two big reasons why that's true. One is inflation, which everyone knows, right? Inflation typically goes up. The cost of, again, think of money as just a tool, but the cost of the things that you purchase with that tool or that money goes up over time. And the second component is, if I invest it today, the thought process is the value increases over time. So if I don't have a chance to invest today, I'm losing out on that opportunity of growth. So that's the kind of the two big components that we're looking at. And again, I have this here. It does confuse a lot of people. I've never ever manually calculated out the IRR because again, you have Excel that does it for you. But important to know, if I'm investing today, how is my investment going to look over the course of time? So understanding that the IRR, internal rate of return, takes into consideration the time in which my return comes back is super important. Anything to add, Harp?
No, I mean, it's interesting to learn the next steps of how that's compounded, because I think a lot of people, will- they just forget about that portion or don't even realize it, and it makes a big difference.
Okay, so we're going to break it down relatively simple here. and we'll take $100,000 and we'll put 100,000. We have two scenarios. We'll do 100,000 and we'll do a 200,000 scenario. In this scenario, it's 100,000. I mean, it comes out to the same thing. But we're looking at 100,000 in debt, annualized at a 12% rate of return. However, we're looking at this not necessarily so we're looking at this from a time value of money. So the debt opportunities that we present to our investors are in 6-month increments, meaning that they'll typically close out somewhere between the 4 to 6 month mark. Sometimes they go over, but typically in the 4 to 6 month mark is when the investment will return. So if I look at that, and I'm just looking at, and all the scenarios that we have here are based off of a 6-month increment. So if we have 100,000 invested at a 12% annualized, again, with 6 months, we basically take that in half. So after 6 months, I'll have a return of 106,000. Now I take that 106,000 and I reinvest that 106,000 for another 6 months. Now, normally, if it was just a 12% annualized return, right, on $100,000 is pretty easy. After a year, it's $12,000. It's even 12,000. However, with the compounding, we basically make an extra $360 in that first year. So instead of the 12,000, we're making 12,360, and that's a 12.36% compounded return, not just the 12. So again, it's important to understand the way the time value of money works and how long is my money locked up into the deal. It helps kind of solve the liquidity issue as well, but relatively easy. So I try to put it in as simple terms as possible. I thought 100,000 invested in 6-month increments at a 12% annualized return gets you to actually 12.36 compounded return over the year. Now, obviously, if you continue to compound that, so the 12.36 stays the same. There's something in the industry called a CAGR, so it's compounded annualized return. That 12.36 stays regardless of the time that it's in. However, your money keeps getting compounded because, again, now take month 12 to 18, you're going to actually be investing 112,360, and that's going to keep compounding on a 12.36% annualized compounded return. Hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully I didn't just confuse anybody. Do you have any questions or anything to add there, Harm?
Nope, I'm not a numbers person, but it made sense.
Okay, so now we want to look at it from, and we'll have another webinar where we're going to kind of dive into risk, because the one thing too that we typically don't look at is, I think too often times than not, we look at the overall return versus the total risk adjusted return. So you normally are going to take into consideration all investments have risks. Somebody tells you it doesn't have risk, they're lying to you. You better run and go the other way. All investments have risk. The amount of risk that you're taking on there's different ways to calculate it. I typically like to look at Sharpe ratio, which is basically let's just look at it's normally off of the risk-free return, which is typically benchmark off the 10-year treasury. You're looking at that return subtracted by the return you're going to get in the investment divided by standard deviation. So it's kind of complicated, and we'll go a little bit more into detail on it. But it basically tells you, okay, what risk am I taking on versus the return that I'm getting. So in this scenario, we're not going to necessarily go over risk. We just know that debt has a lower risk than equity in general because of the way you're positioned on the capital stack. And we'll go a little bit more of that again in the future. But when we're looking at it, so the initial IRR on debt is, again, somewhere, we use a scenario of 12.36, I believe it was, on the slide earlier. So you're roughly ranging between 10, this is 10, but I've seen as low as 8 up to as high as 14, 15 on debt, and it depends. Normally, again, in general, a good rule of thumb too is the higher the return, the higher the risk that you're taking on. It's not always the case, but it's probably a good general rule of thumb to at least be able to look at it and then dig into it a little bit more. On the equity side, 15 to 20% IRR that you typically get. So on the initial look of it, I would look at this and say, oh, wow, I want to go into equity because I'm going to make more money. There's a few caveats to it. One caveat is the liquidity. On the debt side, you typically have frequent exits, so your liquidity is much better, meaning that you'll have access to that capital more frequently than you would on the equity. Your equity hold is typically average of 5 years, sometimes 10 years. It depends on what you're doing. Sometimes up to 20 years on your equity hold, right? If you're buying a property for yourself and you want to hold it, the true value is going to come over holding in the time and having the value appreciate, and you have principal pay down when you're paying down the loan. That's going to take a long time. It's not going to happen over a short period of time. The risk that you're taking on lower risk with a debt because you're basically the bank. On the equity side, again, if you buy a house and you're taking financing onto the house, or you're taking a loan on that house, if you stop paying that loan or the mortgage, the bank's going to take the property back, which is basically how we secure it on the debt side. So again, you're looking at it from the debt versus equity standpoint, and know that you're going to have lower risk profile when you're on the debt. So just say hypothetically, think about it. If we go back to 2008 when we had the financial crisis, and we look at debt, there was a lot of properties and banks needed the liquidity, so slightly separate issue there. But if we paid cash for a property, right, and we're sitting on the property, and a 2008 happens, worst case scenario, we sit on the property. We don't have any mortgage payments we have to pay. You normally have to continue to pay insurance and continue to pay taxes, but there's no other bills that happen during that time frame. On the equity standpoint, however, you still need to continue to pay the mortgage. And again, if you don't pay your mortgage, then they're going to take the property back. So you're putting yourself at higher risk on the equity side versus the debt side. Again, higher risk normally becomes higher reward. So you have to look at it and see what fits into your investment thesis or your risk profile. And then the compounding effect is much more significant on the debt because of the liquidity, you have more frequent exits, and much slower on the equity side because you're normally going to hold the property that much longer. Any questions or comments you had on your side, Harmony?
No, I guess for someone out there looking into investing, it's which is going to be more important to them, and understanding where they are within their journey and what they're wanting to do to see what's going to fit their needs best, whether
Awesome.
it be debt or equity.
Awesome.
Personally,
Okay, so we're good.
I think personally everybody should get in and be diverse and at least be doing debt at some point.
Yeah, I agree. I think looking at both of them helps out, and looking to diversify, which we definitely preach, and that's our fund thesis is based off of diversification, because we do equity as well. There's definitely a place for it. You're just looking to see how your portfolio looks. Now, if you go to Edward Jones or JP Morgan and you sit down with a financial advisor, the first thing they're going to do is try to evaluate your risk profile. Where are you at in life? How much income do you make? Are you more risk adverse, or you want to be able to take on more risk? And they're going to set your portfolio up that way, and they're going to diversify between debt and equity. So I would always recommend doing the same thing and venture out on both, and just see where you're at in your risk profile to see how much equity you want to take on versus how much debt you want to take on. And then just kind of look at it for how much time that you have in, which kind of segues perfectly to the next slide. So in here, we're kind of looking at, so I put a side-by-side scenario over the course of 15 years. And it's not apples to apples, so take it with a grain of salt. But it's basically to illustrate the compounding effect of debt over time versus equity. Now, this is not taking into consideration the compounding effect of equity, which could still happen, right? You could technically have a good IRR and be able to or a good equity multiple on your equity investment, and then cash out and reinvest it. But it's slightly harder. So with debt, it's a fixed term. Normally, our term is in 6-month increments. more times than not, 95% of our loans are in 6-month increments. Sometimes they go slightly over, but typically it's in 6-month increments. Now you're looking at the 6-month increments, and again, you normally will exit somewhere between the 4 to 6 month range. Most of our debt are to rehabilitate single family houses. So it's their fix and flips basically. So the shorter the time period for the borrower, the better, the higher their return. So again, it's typically within the time frame. Now I'm looking at this from a standpoint of the total amount put in is $200,000, and the return profile over the course of, again, 15 years. And as you can see, the equity multiple and the IRR on equity is significantly higher in the first portion of the year. So year one, you're looking at a significantly higher. So this is month 6. This is year one. At the end of year one, you're looking at a 1.2x multiple as compared to a 1.3x multiple. And this is just typical industry. You're going to have different return profiles if you're looking at this is multifamily, and again, they're different depending on what asset class you look at. So this is just a blend of class A, B, and C over the course of I think this is actually only class A and B. So class A and B over the course of the last few years. So this is not just one specific asset. You can get different types of returns. I've seen them from as low as 15. I haven't seen 20s too often. People are underwriting more conservative, which they should. So we're probably more in the 15 to 18, maybe on occasion 19% IRR. This is the underwriting return or projected return that investors or sponsors or syndicators are posting out there. So this is pretty typical. But again, as you can see in the first year, much higher on the equity multiple. But as you come down, so somewhere around year 9, you start to see the equity multiple start to overlap on the debt versus the equity. And you can see the IRR on roughly about year 6 starts to become higher than the multiple on the equity side of it. And then year 15, it's not even a close comparison, right? You're going to, even on the equity multiple, a 5.74x compared to a 4.1x, and a 22% IRR versus a 9.7% IRR. So on the equity side of things, your IRR will always drop the longer the asset is held. And again, take into consideration, this calculation is based off of a non-reinvestment of capital return on your equity multiple. So again, typical hold for a multifamily asset somewhere around 5 years. Most underwriters will underwrite the project with a 5-year. I've seen 10-year holds as well. I've seen longer, but typically you're going to get a 5-year to 10-year hold, and somewhere in between there. 2 years ago, they were exiting out in 1 to 2 years. It was pretty typical. Now, obviously, with the way the market is, they're holding onto the properties a little bit longer. You're probably going to see somewhere closer to the 5 to 7 year holds. So you got to take that into consideration when you're looking at this. Again, this is just comparing the debt reinvested in a 6-month increment to an equity investment that basically does not get reinvested. But just look at the compounding effect. One of the things you want to look at is the compounding effect over time. So your IRR, again, 22.1% IRR, which is extremely high, right? This is your annualized return, taking time value of money into consideration. At the end of 15 years, on a 6-month increment, you're getting $65,000 on the original $200,000 invested. So this is not adding any more money into the investment. All you're basically doing is compounding this $200,000 over the course of 15 years on a 6-month increment. You're at $65,000 in 6 months. So you look at the annualized return, you're over $120,000 annualized return, and you're compounding it. So again, the equity multiple will go up over time. You're getting a 30% cash on cash. That's like insane. You show me an investment that's going to get. I've never seen any equity investment unless you're getting super creative on the financing side of things. I've never seen an investment, a typical traditional equity investment, return of 30% cash on cash return. So again, extremely high cash on cash return, and this is the power of the compounding effect over time. Again, um, I've heard it. I've heard it before, and I ask the question often. And I'll ask it to Harm, like, who is the most progressive and well-known investor that you know of?
Warren Buffett.
Absolutely, Warren Buffett. And you know what his real success is? He's been a phenomenal investor, but do you know what his real success is? Why he's worth hundreds of billions of dollars?
Real estate.
No, time. He
Oh
started
yeah.
investing when he was 11, and I don't know exactly how old he is, but I know he's pretty old. He's in his late 80s, early 90s. And you take that compounding effect over time, because there's other investors, you can go Google it, there's other investors who have historically done higher overall returns, annualized returns than he has. But the amount of wealth that he's amassed over his course of his life has been more towards the fact that he's been doing it for such a long time.
Yeah.
Uh,
How that's intriguing. 11 years old back in his day. I mean, kids these days could do so much more if they chose to, or if they were taught this. But to have someone back in his day at 11 years old start investing is pretty amazing.
yep. But again, kind of speaks to the compounding effect over time. So this is just a graph that kind of basically the same exact data, but just shows you a graph, and you can see the difference between. So up here you have your IRR, and down here you have your equity multiple, and you can start to see. So debt start over the course of time starts to pull away on the IRR from the equity, and same thing with the equity multiple over time. And again, take this equity multiple into consideration. This is not a reinvestment of the equity, but this gives you a kind of graphical error of the opportunities that you guys have on the debt side of things. So it's definitely there. There's definitely an opportunity, and our goal is to help you kind of just educate you on what that means, like, and how to really look at the math. Because the math part is what kind of tricks everybody up. They just look at a number, not necessarily understanding how to do the math. But let me take one step back. Again, normally if I'm looking at this, in I'm kind of one of them spreadsheet geeks and nerds. So I like looking at it. But normally I'm going to look at it similar to this, and I'm going to calculate these IR components based off of the course of time, so I can tell each year where my IRR is going to be, and then I can see if it's a good investment or not. Do I want to take on this investment? Again, the first thing I'm going to look at is the risk profile and my liquidity. Do I have enough liquidity to take on that risk? If I don't, then it's an easy no. But after that, I'm going to look at the return profile over the course of time and see, is this going to give me a higher return that I can make elsewhere? And is the risk that I'm taking on worth the return that I'm going to get? That's probably the biggest takeaway is, and why it's so important to sort of understand the math behind it. Because if I can take on significantly less risk and make close to the amount of return that I'm going to get, I'm going to take that. Because again, on the equity side, there's a chance that you're going to lose on the equity. We've lost on the equity side in this last go around. However, on the debt side, it's more consistent, because again, where you sit on the risk profile and where you sit on the capital stack. So
We're very comfortable with it, and I think the understanding, because a lot of people will do, debt investing on their own, hard money and all of that. But understanding the risk with it, for us, it doesn't feel as risky because we are comfortable with it. You are also a licensed contractor. We understand what it will take if we need to take back that property and the things that we can do with it. There's multiple exits there that keep us more comfortable. Like you said, all investing has a risk. Understanding what those risks are, and for us, it becomes less of a risk because we can do one of any of those exit strategies and comfortably.
yep. So kind of wrapping this all up, we're at the bottom of the half hour. Kind of wrapping this up. I think the goal is just to kind of educate everyone out there on how to really look at their investment, and we're going to dive more on our next event, our next webinar, on looking at like the risk profile that you're taking on, because it's important to really understand that. Don't just chase the highest return profile out there. You need to understand and factor in liquidity, income versus growth priorities, and then look at the compounding effect too. And what kind of return can I get compounded over time? And then, like I said, your risk tolerance. Normally, the risk tolerance is what I'm going to look at first. What kind of risk am I taking on? And do I have the liquidity to take on that risk? And again, what I mean by that is the higher the risk, the higher the chance you have of losing everything. So, again, the higher the rewards will typically be. So you want to be able to look at diversifying your investment between all of the profiles, because you want some of those heavy hitters where you're going to hit it out of the park and maybe even get 5-10x return on your capital. Those investments are out there, but those investments have a larger chance, a larger risk of you losing everything. So kind of understanding that as well, and then be able to look at your liquidity, look at your overall portfolio, and be able to intelligently allocate money where you best feel suited for the course of the long run. Again, taking into consideration Warren Buffett, he had some losses. Everyone has some losses. No one can ever pick all of the right winners. So you have to be able to accommodate for it. But again, you look at, he's holding the highest amount of treasuries in the world. So and there's some value to understanding and knowing why people do that. Again, a lot of it's diversification on mitigating your risk. So again, we're a proponent of both of them. We invest in the equities. We invest in the equity market. We invest in venture capital. So there's different investments that we invest in. Our goal here is to kind of educate you on the different opportunities. And we definitely invest in debt. A larger portion of Harmony's and mine portfolio is in debt. So again, where we can weather any storms when equity investments are not necessarily paying out, or maybe there's a foreclosure on the property, or there's just no cash flow because of what interest rates have done over the course of the last few years. We're still okay because a larger portion is in debt, and we're getting consistent payments on the debt side of things. So, any last words to add?
Yeah, having them look at where they are, if they're not sure where they are or how they should be splitting up and being diverse, to check out our calculator on our website. You can go to partnerwithrise.com. On the top, there's little tabs there. You can go and see our retirement calculator, see how aggressive you should be, you don't need to be, and how to split that all up. And if you ever want to know more or look at different options, whether it be with us or someone else, we love having helping people look at their journeys to see where they're at and what's going to be the best fit for them.
All right, phenomenal. Thank you, Harmony, for joining me. Had fun. Hopefully we got some education out there. Hopefully I didn't confuse anybody with that weird IR. Again, I've never used that calculation. I use Excel or ask my new cousin ChatGPT for the answer. But I had fun. Hopefully you guys did too, and we'll definitely connect and see you guys again soon.
See you guys later.
All right, aloha.
Bye.